detail that is now finding its way by researchers now into the general media. I'm not going to labour any further on it, but I'll hand you straight over because we've run over 8:10 or more, and I'll hand you over to Robert. Thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Okay, so good evening, everyone. Thank you very much to Tony and the Genealogical Society for giving me the opportunity to speak here this evening. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So the Pensions Project was established in 2008. It is a joint project between the Defence Forces and the Department of Defence. It is mandated to continue until 2023. To date, there have been 8 releases from the collection, the most recent of which occurred on the 2nd of October last, when the files of a further 1,500 individuals were released into the public domain. So this brought the total to just over 9,500 pension files online. In February 2019, we also had a very significant release with the launch of the Brigade activity reports, and I will talk about more of them later on. So just an overview then of the talk this evening. It should take about 25-30 minutes, and I'm just going to talk about some of the different series in the collection, and then examples using different individuals, and then finally hopefully demonstrating how the collection can be utilised by yourselves as genealogical researchers. So before I go on any further, I want to explain my title, From Tullamore to Trinidad. And this came about because while researching, I came across the file of John Francis Doody. Now you can see there that he's had numerous addresses across Ireland, England, and then around the globe. Now his story is that he served with the Tullamore Company of the IRA, and then later served with the Offaly Active Service Unit. He would then join the National Forces in 1922, but deserted and rejoined the anti-treaty IRA. He's then arrested in November 1922, court-martialed and sentenced to 168 days in Arbour Hill. So many of the addresses that you can see there come from his application, as he was employed as a ship's purser in the 1940s and the 1960s. So you can see that the pensions administration, pension system, follows the veterans, follows their journey around the world. And Doody was awarded a pension of just over 4.5 years, almost 5 years, and he dies then in Tullamore in 1963. But it just serves as an example of how the bureaucracy followed the veteran. So that explains my title. Accessing the pensions collection. The vast majority of everything I'm going to talk about this evening is available online, and this includes the pension files, nominal rolls, the Brigade activity reports, and then the departmental files and other administrative files. The medal series are only available in the reading room, and you have to visit the military archives to view those material. That's done by appointment only, and they are open Tuesday to Thursday between 10 and 4. Okay, so what is in the Military Service Pensions Collection? It's just one of the archive collections of military archives. The collection contains a total of 40 or so series, and I'm just going to talk about 4 or 5 of these today. And these include the nominal rolls, the activity reports, the medal files, and then the pension files. So here we have a screenshot of the ADLIB database that the archivists catalogue into. And this is just from one element. So we record, where possible, about 40 different fields of information related to individuals. And these include obviously their name, their address, their maiden names, aliases, diminutive form of name, date of birth, date of death, and then their civilian occupation or any other individuals that we've come across that they're related to. So this isn't possible in every case, it just depends on the individual file. But where we can, because we know that the more information we can put into it, the better it is for yourselves as doing the research. So I'm going to move on now and I'm going to talk about the nominal rolls. And this series contains 611 files for the IRA, Cumann na mBan, na Fianna Éireann and the Irish Citizens Army. It represents all 16 divisions of the IRA and there are 87 brigades. There's almost 50,000 documents in the nominal roll series, and they were created on what were called the first and second critical dates, so that being the 11th of July 1921, the truce, date of the truce, and then the 1st of July 1922, so just after the outbreak of the Civil War. They were compiled in the mid-1930s, and I think due to the lack of census information between that 11 to 26 period, they sort of act as a bit of a snapshot, because you can see where certain individuals, because they will mostly list the name of the person with their address. So it's not only Ireland that the nominal rolls cover for the IRA or Cumann na mBan. There's also units in Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle upon Tyne, London, Scotland and even the USA. So I've just taken an example here from one of the rolls, CNB 125, and this is for South County Dublin, Cumann na mBan, so the local area here. And there you have the names of the different branches, the maiden name and the married name of those women who were members of Cumann na mBan for Dunleary, Blackrock, Dean's Grange, Bray and Dundrum. So the way Cumann na mBan was structured was largely on a county basis. So you had a number of branches which made up a district, and then the districts made up the brigade. And you can see there at the bottom of the document, the officer has written, "I recollect that 16 members of the above branches have died, as we've attended most of their funerals, RIP." So that's just one example. The membership rolls for the IRA then are largely similar. So I'm going to move on now to the brigade activity reports. So as I've already mentioned, these were released in February 2019. They're a relatively small series in that they contain just 151 files, but they are what they lack for in quantity they certainly make up for in their quality. The activity files came about following the introduction of the Pensions Act in 1934. This opened the legislation to those members of Cumann na mBan and anti-treaty IRA. The pensions, the advisory board and the referee quickly became overwhelmed. There are a total of 66,000 applications under that 34 legislation. So as you can imagine, it became very difficult to process all these applications. So an idea from Humphrey Murphy, who was a former Brigade OC with the Kerry IRA, suggested that brigade committees would be established around the country, and these brigade committees would be responsible for collating the activities of the IRA, and it evolved into a very complex project. These brigade committees, the officers on these committees were already supplying information in the form of references to individuals. And what we have here on the screen on the right hand side is an extract from the 2nd Offaly Brigade. That's what we would deem a pro forma. You can see that their brigade committees have been asked for a huge amount of information. You have the numbers of the IRA, the type of arms they were using, the number of shots fired, the type of terrain the activity took place on, as well then as the number of the enemy that were engaged. You've got the names of the IRA, the company that they were members of, and then finally the battalion. So the activity reports are somewhat inconsistent. For example, these pro formas don't exist on absolutely every file. Along with the release then, we also launched a website which contains over 8,300 locations right across the country. Of these then, there were 220 highlights featured. So there's something there for everyone. There's something there to research everyone. For example, in one of the Kerry activity reports, an attack on a barracks, it lists the name and addresses, I think, of some 287 individuals who took part in that attack. So there's a huge level of information in there, and they're well worth using.
Must be a big barracks.
If, for example, you had, so say for example your relative hasn't been released among the medals or the pension files as yet, the nominal rolls and the Brigade activity reports would be a good place to start in carrying out your research. So moving on to those medal files, there's over 47,500 applications in the series. They are not digitised, as I said. You'd have to visit the military archives. There is, however, an online database which lists all the individuals, and that's fully searchable. The medal series, one advantage I suppose it has over the pensions is that it's been catalogued in its entirety, so all 47,500 are done. The medal files were created then from 1941 following a government decision to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the Easter Rising by issuing the 1916 medal. And this then was followed in 1942 with the creation of the 1917-21 service medal, sometimes more commonly referred to as the black and tan medal. So there you have the different figures of the awards under the medal series. So I'm going to talk now about the pensions series, which is by far and away the largest in the pensions collection. It's created under two strands of legislation: the Military Service Pensions Act, which date between 1924 and 1949, and the Army Pensions Act, which date between 1923 and 53. The pensions series, for most individuals, contains at least 2 files. However, for some there may be up to 10 files for one individual. You have to remember as well that of this 70 or 80,000, only 18,000 are successful. And at the moment the project focuses on cataloguing these successful pensions first. The Army Pensions Act, so I believe it's a great friend to researchers. The Army Pensions Act, the files under that series are the wound pensions, the disablement pensions, and then those files for individuals that were killed. So while the files were created to make a financial reward to those who were killed or wounded during the 16 to 23 period, they also inadvertently created a source that tracks the social, financial and well-being of the families in 20th century Ireland. And here we have an example of just some of the genealogical style information contained therein. So you have there the types of certificates and the numbers in brackets thereafter. So we've got birth, baptism, marriage and death. We also then have the dependency reports, education expenses, special allowances, funeral expenses and remarriage material. So I'm just going to talk about one or two of these. So the first one would be the special allowances. The special allowances were created from the 1930s when individuals who either reached certain means or a certain age were entitled to apply for an allowance from the department. So these provide a huge level of information because as part of the process a social welfare officer would be sent out from the local office to interview the applicant, and this would detail their names and addresses, the names of their children, if they're a farmer, for example, how much land they had, what sort of stock, fowl, how much of it's under how much of it's under what? Yes, that's the word, thank you. So there's a huge level of information contained in those, and that's not just one element. The social welfare officer would come out every year and carry out the same thing. So you're well able to track individuals there and their means. There's also then material relating to the education expenses. So this was one element where, if in the case of a death, the family, if the person had any children underage, they were entitled to have their education expenses paid for by the department. So again, there's a huge level of information in there to be able to follow the lives of the children of those that were killed. So I'm just going to take one example here, and this is in the case of William Johnston, and you have his file reference there. He was a corporal with the 62nd Infantry Battalion of the National Forces, and he died at Ponsonby Barracks in the Curragh, or rather I should say he was shot dead by a private Kilorlin on the 20th of December 1923. So his widow, Mary Johnston, and she applies and is awarded an allowance of 17 shillings and sixpence, and then also an allowance for each of her two children. Now Mary is applying from her home address in 65 Greenhill Street, Glasgow, and as part of the process she would have to submit her marriage certificate, and there you have it on screen, which shows that in 1919 William and Mary got married. And as part of the process as well, she had to supply the birth certificates or extract of entry for each of her two children. So again, another element of genealogical information. One of the other elements then that's contained in due to this Army Pensions Act is a strand where widows, if they decided to get remarried, were entitled to a one-off payment or a remarriage gratuity. And here we have the example. So Mary gets remarried in 1942 to a John McPhillips in St. Aloysius Church in Glasgow, and there you have his profession, etc. But because of that piece of legislation, that wording addition in the legislation, we have over 50 examples of remarriages occurring in the dependents series. So you can see that also is another element to help to assist you to track individuals. So I've already mentioned the dependents reports, and here's just one example of them. And it refers to a Patrick Bennett. And Patrick was a member of B Company 3 Tipperary Brigade IRA, and he died at Schlieve-na-Mon on the 3rd of December 1922. His father, John, makes the application, and this investigation here was carried out by the local Custom and Excise officer. So it does make for some difficult reading, and I will read just an extract or pieces thereof. So it states that Patrick, who was the eldest working child, was the chief support of the family. He was employed as a farm labourer and earned £19 per annum. Of this £19 then, he would give between 5 and 10 to his father John. So the report reveals that John, the father, was employed as a farm labourer and was in receipt of 9 shillings per week in 1923. He also had use of the house, but he didn't have any land to work for himself. So following Patrick's death, John is forced to give up his employment and therefore loses the home. He had to give up his employment because he was a widower with 10 children, ranging in ages between 18 months and 21 years. So the report reveals then how the family's circumstances drastically changed following the death of Patrick. So the eldest daughters, Mary and Rose, who in 1923 were acting as housekeepers to the younger children, were forced to go to England in order to find work. As a result, John had to place 3 of his children in Cashel Industrial School, where 2 of them actually died. Moreover, by 1934, none of Mr. Bennett's children were in a position to assist him financially. And indeed, he was actually required to supply one of his married daughters, with vegetables and milk. So it was a very difficult report to go through, and a difficult enough file to go through as a result. John then is eventually, after representations and appeals, is awarded an allowance in 1940, and this continued on then to his death in 1944. But it does show that these reports, which were gathered by either the local police, the Custom and Excise officer, or local clergy, or if someone was applying from outside outside of Ireland, they would be carried out by the police force in England, or Northern Ireland, it could be a member of the clergy or a trusted individual. But you can see that the huge level of detail, and it's providing that snapshot in the early 1920s of the social conditions and how dependent people were on the employment that the veteran would have had. So here I've taken an example from our database of some of the countries that are listed among the pension files, and obviously you've got some of the usual suspects in England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales, but some of the others include China, Libya, Italy, Sudan, Trinidad of course, Yemen and Zimbabwe. So again, it's an example of the range and where the veterans actually ended up. So, as you're probably all aware, the pensions collection has featured in shows such as Who Do You Think You Are, and particularly in the episodes, just some of these, Brendan McCarroll, Dermot Gavin, most recently I think it was Paul Merton I should say. I've had Martin Sheen in the past, and last season I think it was Boy George. So I also had a look at some of the literary connections in the pensions collection, and I'm just going to talk about, this is only a small sample of those that we've come across so far. I'll just go through some of them because I'm sure some male surnames may be familiar to you already. So first of all we have Hannah Keane, Nee Pirtle, and Hannah is the mother of author John B. Keane, actor Eamon Keane, and the grandmother of BBC journalist Fergal Keane. Her medal file is available in the military archives, and in our last release we also launched the files of her two brothers, Edward and Michael Pirtle. Then we have Patrick and Michael Tobin. Patrick Tobin is the grandfather of novelist and playwright Colm Tobin, and Michael Tobin then would have been the grand uncle of Colm. We then have Malachy McCourt. He is the father of Malachy, Alfie and Frank McCourt. Robert and Una Brennan, their daughter became a journalist and a writer for the New Yorker, and she was the first cousin of Roddy Doyle, and Roddy Doyle of course is famous for numerous works including The Commitments, The Snapper and The Van. John Furlong there, he's a 1916 veteran, he dies in 1918, and the application is made by his widow Kathleen. Kathleen remarries I think in early 1920s to Stephen Behan, and she goes on then to be the mother of the brothers Brendan, Dominic and Brian Behan. And then finally we have Francis McGarhan. Francis was a member of D Company 6th Battalion Longford Brigade, and he goes on then to join the Garda Síochána, and he's based in Coot Hill. He of course then is the father of John McGarhan, author of The Barracks and Amongst Women. And that's just some of the examples of the literary connections in the collection. And then just to turn to some of the international connections, because we're so used to using for Irish, we're used to for tracking our Irish relatives, but there are a number of individuals, and again this is a small sample of individuals who had no connection to Ireland or very little connection to Ireland that end up taking part in the revolutionary period. So the first example there is Robert Briscoe. So according to the 1911 census, the Briscoes were living at Upper Leeson Street, and Robert's father listed his birthplace as Russia, while his mother Ida listed her birthplace as Germany. So their religion was entered as Jewish, and their father became a committed nationalist, so much so that he named one of his sons Robert Emmett Briscoe and the other Wolfe Tone Briscoe. We then have Charles Steinmeier. So Steinmeier, they seem to be the only family, according to the census, there's only the one family in Ireland, and they were living at 6 Florence Street in 1901. So Charles Steinmeier's father listed his place of birth as Cologne in Germany, and his occupation was as a ladies' hairdresser and wig maker. Then we have Captain Louis Marie. At the time of the 1911 census, they were living at 2 Fairview Strand. And Louis' father, Charles Marie, lists his birthplace as France and his occupation as a commercial travelling photographer. Then we have John Kilgannon. John is born in America to Irish parents and lived in Long Island, New York. So according to a New York Times article, as of 2016, Kilgannon was sent to Dublin to Rathfarnham to St Enda's school because he had taken his father's car without permission and crashed it. So he was shipped off to the school in Rathfarnham. And of course there he comes under the influence, joins the Irish Volunteers, and then takes part in different events there. And then finally, just to mention the last three there, we've got Charles Chidley, Reginald Stenning and George Meade Larkin. All of these are former members of the British Army who seem to have absolutely no connection to Ireland. Stenning is actually executed in March or April 1923 for taking part in activities for the IRA in County Kerry. So the second last thing I want to talk about is the Connacht Rangers. And normally we don't expect a British Army regiment there to be any files in the revolutionary papers concerning Ireland. However, under legislation in 1936, the government did make a ward available to members of the Connacht Rangers who took part in the mutiny in June 1920. So the Connacht Rangers mutinied over the treatment by the British soldiers of the Irish, and while they were stationed in Jalandhar and in Ceylon in India. So in July 1920, some members at Ceylon stormed or attempted to storm the magazine fort. 2 were killed and 1 was injured. So another individual then, James Joseph Daly, he was actually arrested. He was court-martialed and executed then in November 1920. So under this strand of legislation, there are 260 applications, so former members of the Connacht Rangers who applied under that scheme for financial reward. So it's not something you're going to expect to find typically in a collection such as ours. And going back to the Army Pensions Act, this time in 1937, so the pensions collection is not just reserved for those organisations like Tullamore, IRA, the Irish Volunteers. There are, for example, as my last search, there's 48 individuals who are listed as civilians, and there's a special group of 12 of these who under the 37 Act could claim, because if they were keeping arms for one of the organisations, or if they were wounded accidentally or wounded by one of the members of the organisations, they were entitled to claim. And the one example that I've chosen refers to the story of Thomas McCain. And Thomas McCain lived at Henry Place in Dublin in 1916, and what the story is that while members of the Irish Volunteers were retreating from the GPO, they attempted to gain access to McCain's house, and in the melee a number of shots were fired. McCain was hit, he says, 7 or 8 times, and one of the bullets actually passed through him and hit his daughter, who was standing behind him, and killed his daughter, and she was only 16 at the time. So he makes his application in 1937, and he's awarded a gratuity, a lump sum of £100. So this just serves to illustrate that it's not exclusively members of the IRA, Tullamore, etc. that made applications. There are a number of civilians in there, and this should be considered as well when you're doing your research, that it's still worth checking just in case someone had made an application. So there we have our contact details, and I think that pretty much concludes. So I'd just like to say that the pensions collection is not just a source of military history. It doesn't cease in 1923, but rather it begins its charting of the economic, social and the familial history throughout 20th century Ireland and across the world. And I hope that I have demonstrated that here this evening, and that you will all make use of the collection in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you.